Is a peace plan really on the table to end the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran? Washington says it sent a 15-point proposal to Pakistan to potentially host talks. Whether Iran will see that as a starting point for negotiations is unclear. But with reports restating U.S. demands to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile program, are efforts doomed to fail? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. With so much at stake, especially in terms of global energy supply and economic stability, negotiating an end to the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran is paramount. But even if a plan is on the table, the reported conditions the U.S. has laid out will most likely be unacceptable to Iran. Beyond that, other agendas are at play here. Though it's not entirely clear exactly what stakeholders want, some rather nefarious agendas are being reported. Not least, the Saudi crown prince pushing Washington to continue the war on Iran, while Moscow pushes for diplomacy, possibly to make sure its favored regime stays in power, or to be able to cut a better deal with the U.S. on Ukraine. Also, with the Iran war stealing the world's attention, is Israel left with free rein to wreak havoc on Lebanon, Gaza, and the West Bank? Here's a look at the convoluted picture behind the scenes.
Day 26 of the Iran war, and the world is no clearer when it will end. On Tuesday, the US President, Donald Trump, said Iran was giving the US a massive present worth a lot of money, though he was vague on specific details, revealing it was oil and gas related.
We're having, by the way, a tremendous success, as you know, in Iran. The leaders are all gone. Nobody knows who to talk to. But we're actually talking to the right people, and they want to make a deal so badly. You have no idea how badly they want to make a deal.
The US is reported to have presented Iran with a 15-point plan to end the war. But Iran has denied this, and even mocked the US president with his own catchphrase.
Hey Trump, you are fired. You are familiar with this sentence. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Despite heavy strikes on its military infrastructure and leadership losses, Iran's regime remains in place, and the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively blocked to most oil shipments. But other players are benefiting from the conflict in indirect ways. The Kremlin is cashing in on global supply interruptions by selling its own oil. The European Commission has dropped plans for a permanent ban on Russian oil tied to Russia's war in Ukraine. And India, meanwhile, has made major recent purchases of Russian fuel. But the short-term gain could fuel longer-term uncertainty. A Kremlin spokesperson said Russia would view an escalation of the Iran war into their Caspian region, though only speculative at this stage, extremely negatively. Meanwhile, China is extremely reliant on Iranian and Middle Eastern oil for much of its energy needs. But short-term pain could be China's long-term gain. China has built up extensive oil reserves, and with the US armed forces being spread thin as some naval assets are called from the region to the Middle East instead, China could become emboldened in any future action on Taiwan. Donald Trump has already postponed a planned visit to China this month due to the Iran war, and Beijing could leverage this to its advantage in future US tariff negotiations. Massive investments in electric vehicle technology could attract other nations aiming to cut fossil fuel dependence, while China maintains near total control over rare earths crucial for tech and computer chips. Riyadh has a lot to gain from rising oil prices, but Saudi Arabia sits well within Iran's crosshairs. Several oil and gas sites in Saudi Arabia have been hit by Iran since the war began. Reports suggest Saudi's ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, might be pressing the US to continue the war against Iran, its strategic and security rival, though Saudi officials have denied this. All wars end eventually, but as for the US-Israel war on Iran, nobody is truly certain when that end will come.
Joining me now to speak further about prospects for resolution is from Tehran, Iranian affairs analyst Seyed Khoshcheshm. Thank you so much for being with me. First of all, there's talk about talks in Pakistan as early as next week, which actually still falls after the delayed deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump is saying it is Iran that wants a deal here and that the U.S. is talking to high-level people or a person. So at what level is any actual agreement being discussed with Iran?
Hello, thanks for having me. Well, he is a pathological liar, and everyone knows about that. He tells lies, too many lies every day. And this is one of them. Iran has the upper hand in the military field. The U.S. has failed in obtaining any of its goals, including regime change, changing the leader, that could be palatable to the United States, or partnering in picking up a new leader. And then they failed also in steering riots and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So that has given Iran the upper hand, and that's why Iran stresses that all its conditions should be met, including war indemnity, evacuation of the U.S. bases in the region, and also guarantees that such a war would not break out again. So as you're hearing words from Washington, they are not talking at all about these things. The things that Donald Trump or the media outlets are claiming, they all talk about the same old goals and objectives that they had when they opened the war. So all in all, I can tell you that nothing is serious actually here. Yes, we know that he has sent some proposals through interlocutors, but he has not received any response yet. My guess is that the proposals will be rejected outright.
Okay, yeah, because I mean, it's kind of obvious
they're
to
not talking
say.
about what Iran wants.
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest obstacles here, when you talk about Iran getting guarantees, is getting Iran to trust those guarantees, having seen that agreements can be thrown out the window, and that the United States and Israel, to a large extent, they don't have to adhere to international law. When they don't, there have been no consequences, as the recent decades will actually show us. But I want to move on to another issue and ask what you make of the other stakeholders' interest in this conflict. We can start with just the reports that Saudi Arabia might actually want the war to continue.
Well, let me first talk a little bit about the guarantees that you just mentioned. You are right, and that's probably why Iran now believes that guarantees and insurances should be practical moves and measures at its own hand. That's why Iran is calling for the evacuation of the U.S. bases in the region. That's one of the guarantees, actually.
Right.
So that matters a lot. And that will be a sticking point in any talks that might arise in future. Now, what we know is that the U.S. is willing for talks very much after failure in obtaining its goals in the military field. And at the same time, Donald Trump wants to give himself the image of the winning party, to appear in the talks as the winning party. That's for his image. So that's why he is just talking about Iran willing to have the talks. Yeah. About Saudi Arabia, well, the Saudis have rejected that. They denied the report that came out in the U.S. media saying that they are joining forces with the U.S. and they want the war to continue. But we don't know really what they mean in this regard. But I don't think that if countries on the southern rims of the Persian Gulf, if they are wise, they shouldn't be willing for further war. Because in this war, their energy fields, their bases, they are getting destroyed. And they are paying for that. They had the U.S. bases in the region, in their countries, in order to protect them. And now they are paying for protecting the United States, and that's ridiculous. So,
So you
we
believe
believe
these
that
Saudi denials?
Saudis should,
If you,
yeah.
yeah, you believe the Saudi denials in this case. I mean, we have to remember they signed a cooperation agreement with Iran just 2 years ago to start building relations again. So you don't know who is potentially being incredibly duplicitous or not. But there's also another player involved, and I'll ask you about Russia also talking to Washington about potentially a deal on Ukraine that could involve pushing Iran into these negotiations and pushing Iran to take a position that it might not ultimately want to take, but it needs Russia as an ally. What do you make of those?
You know, Iran is fighting the United States and Israel, and it doesn't really need to have anyone else to back it up. Iran is using its own weapons that has been made in Iran and not in Russia. So it doesn't need actually the military or much of the support from Russia, but of course it needs the political support. Country that could, condemn the United States and Israel's violation of international rules and regulations and opening war on Iran. But I don't think that the Russians could yield much influence on Iran. Actually, yesterday, the Russians called on Israel and the United States to admit defeat and failure in this war as soon as possible. So that's what we expect the Russians to do, to make him and to convince these parties that if they go on, then Tehran would, go for escalating the war throughout the region. That would wreak havoc on global community, everyone in this war.
Okay, very quickly, just express whatever your fears are or are not regarding the potential for the U.S. to send ground troops into Iran.
We actually, not only expect that, but also welcome such a move, because Iranians have very, very powerful ground troops, and we believe that Tehran now has the upper hand. But to enforce its conditions in any kind of future talks, maybe a month later, 2 months later, I don't know when, but at the end of the war, then Tehran needs to still have a very much more stronger hand in the military field. And that could only be achieved through a major defeat in the battlefield in front of the cameras. If you can see hundreds of U.S. soldiers, dead bodies spread across Iranian territories, especially in the Persian Gulf Island, then that could put an end to this U.S. and Israeli savagery and, dreams, and could make him, face with reality. So really, Iranian military, as well as analysts, we expect, and we not just expect, but we would welcome any such lunatic move or crazy move by the U.S.
That is an incredibly grim outlook, but Seyed Khoshcheshm, I appreciate you sharing that opinion with us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this segment of Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay, let's broaden out the discussion now. And joining me from Washington, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, Natasha Hall. From London, Professorial Research Fellow at SOAS, Haim Bresheeth. And also from the U.S. Capitol Director of the Future of DHS Project at the Atlantic Council, Thomas Warwick. Thanks all so much for being with me. Natasha, I was actually going to start with you and ask about this 15-point peace plan, but let me hold off on that because given what you just heard in the interview with Tehran, the fact that the Iranian military would actually welcome a U.S. ground troop invasion and the quote-unquote lunacy that it would bring, because at least the United States would actually get to see firsthand what it's up against and how powerful Iranian ground troops can actually be. What do you make of that?
So I think that there's a lot of confusing signals coming out of the White House more generally. And I think a lot of this was more bravado from President Trump and efforts to signal to markets to stabilize and show that he is amenable to some kind of off ramp when it comes to this conflict. But it remains to be seen what this 15-point plan exactly is, whether the Iranians would accept it, whether the Israelis would accept it. And I think at this point, and you heard it from your previous guests, I think Iran would, in some regards, want to draw this out to establish deterrence, to make sure that the US and Israel don't continue to, so to speak, mow the lawn, and every few months, every couple of years, come back and lay waste to Iran's infrastructure once again. So I think that they really want to establish deterrence with global markets, especially, and ensure that Gulf states and all other countries that are intermediaries push, the U.S. president or the U.S. administration, whichever it is, not to go to war once again.
Yeah, it's incredible how many Iranians have said from the very beginning that this is a U.S. attempt to actually manipulate the markets directly for their own gain. But I also wanted to ask you on the peace plan, we have to remember it's not the first time a 15-point peace plan has actually been pitched. In fact, there was one just last year, right before the U.S. supposedly obliterated Iran's nuclear program. So have you heard at least anything more promising about this latest proposal and whether it's actually really on the table anywhere, and if Pakistan can prove to be the conduit or the mediator that could break this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it remains to be seen, but it seems like Trump is putting everything out there, bringing the 2,000 troops to the Gulf, and really trying to use every bit of leverage to give Iran an off-ramp, to give himself an off-ramp, but really to increase U.S. leverage in the face of whatever negotiations back channel happen to be going on right now. But it's not clear to me that there's anything more promising about this 15-point plan or the 20-point plan for Gaza. There's a lot of multiple point plans that haven't really been particularly successful.
Okay, Tom, let me turn to you, because when we actually spoke a few weeks ago, I have to raise this first. I mean, you stressed that, any threat to oil supplies in the Gulf wouldn't actually burden the United States because unlike in the 1970s, the U.S. doesn't rely on Gulf oil supplies. I think it's safe to say now that this war has actually burdened the United States as well as the rest of the world. So would you still downplay the effects of this war, first on the supply chain, as well as what pressure it really is putting on the Trump administration right now?
Well, good morning to you and everyone. The effect in the United States has been to raise gasoline prices by 60 cents a gallon. And those prices could go a bit higher. But President Trump and his team are confident that prices will go down when the war finally stops. And by the time we get to November, Americans will have forgotten much of what went on in March and April. That is still at least a probable calculus, with one huge exception we'll talk about in a second. The real problem, as I said back then, is in Asia, because they're looking at actual shortages where price isn't enough. If the supplies of oil simply are not there, China's economy goes into recession, and other Asian countries face real economic difficulties that higher prices alone just do not solve. So that much is still true. The one thing that is the huge spoiler in all of this is the willingness of both sides to talk tough. And a lot of what we're seeing right now is strong rhetoric, each side considering international public opinion to be another front in this war. And so you have President Trump threatening to take out power plants, threatening to take Kharg Island, Iran threatening to do similar things to the Gulf. And those things are hugely concerning, hugely destabilizing. We know that in addition to the Trump statement that talks are underway, and what that really means is preliminary discussions are going on with India, with Pakistan, with Turkey, with Qatar, with other countries, mediators talking to both sides. But the other reality is that Gulf Arab countries came to Washington or told President Trump over the phone that they really are concerned that strikes could get the entire situation spinning out of control. So that is very much the wild card in all of this. And so far, things haven't gotten that far out of control. Obviously, all of this could change very easily by mistakes on either side.
Yeah, it most certainly could. And I don't know if either side would actually consider any of it a mistake. They both want to look like they are carrying out the threats that they promised, so that neither one looks weak.
Right. Mistakes like that are often viewed only in hindsight.
Yeah.
Countries have blundered into wars before. That's one of the hallmarks of history.
Yeah. Haim, let me come to you and then just ask, first of all, if you actually foresee any talks taking place in Pakistan or wherever, and what about the other agendas that I had referred to at play here, not least from your perspective, all of this chaos only serving to give Israel a free hand in Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, potentially Iraq, and anywhere else where it sees the completion of the endgame that it wants?
Well, let's start with Israel. Israel doesn't need anything like that to invade Lebanon, but it helps. The agenda of Israel is endless war to extend the mini empire that they now control, which they want to be much larger. And they are likely to be able to do that with as long as Trump is in the White House. The other thing is, let's just see what was achieved in almost 4 weeks of this war. We can see the death and destruction. In Iran, 1,500 people were killed and many thousands have been hurt, and the damage is just unbelievable. The same is true about Lebanon. And now let's think about what happened to the American empire in Arabia and the GCC. All these bases are gone. An investment of decades in building those bases is gone. And it's very unclear that they will be able to come back to those bases if an arrangement is arrived at with Iran. So all in all, there is a crisis, a financial crisis across the world. There are problems also in the US with the prices of oil and diesel. There is uncertainty in the markets that is not good for world economy. And I can't see anything positive that the Americans have got in the first 4 weeks or so. They are supposed to have spent something like $1 trillion already, and they're asking for 200 billion additional costs.
Okay.
So basically, there is nothing positive on the horizon, and I don't think that playing a television negotiation is going to change this. The Iranians are not going to jump for this.
Okay. Natasha, I could see you agree with some of what you heard there. So I'm wondering, what is your take on that analysis, as well as the other potential agendas at play, including what I spoke with our guest in Tehran about, who doesn't believe reports that the Saudi crown prince had ever said that they want this war with Iran to continue, because that's not a unique analysis. I had heard that before, that there are goals of different Gulf states to further try to undermine Iran so that they can eliminate an Iranian foe as any competition in the region.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to understand how this would be advantageous for Gulf states or for Saudi's 2030 vision. This is all about stabilizing the region as a hub for trade and tourism, energy, etc. So it's unclear to me how this war would forward those desires at all. That said, we're in the midst of a war now. And so they are very dependent on the United States for their defense. They realize that Iran is now a wounded tiger, and that much of the detente that you just spoke about has been laid waste to, it seems, at least temporarily. And so they're going to have to do something in order to deter Iran from moving forward with a lot of its attacks on the Gulf. But I think zooming out just a little bit, and just a final point on this, Iran has an enormous capacity for death and destruction. winning would mean survival. We saw hundreds of thousands of people killed, during the Iran-Iraq war. And as Haim suggested, Israel is happy to be on forever war footing, but it's unclear whether America or Gulf states or anyone else wants to be on forever war footing. If the American people can't deal with 60 cents more per gallon for this war, it's unclear if they're going to deal with, even larger consequences as it moves forward. And I think Iran knows that. So what we're looking at here is almost a war of attrition, and whether or not Trump can see the off-ramp for himself. We've already heard him say things like, we've already seen regime change, so we've already won. And so, he might be backpedaling at this point, realizing the consequences for his party.
Natasha, I'm not sure if we've lost your connection. I think you might still be there. But before I do lose you, because I know you have to go, when you talk about a war of attrition still does equal incremental escalation. So before you leave, where do you see, I feel I overuse this term because I don't think it should be described as an end game because we don't really see an end. But where do you see it actually going? What will this mean for the global economy, for all the stakeholders involved?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's one's capacity for punishment and for attrition and playing time. So we know Russia in Ukraine knew that it could just play for time. Iran can do that as well. And so the question here is whether Trump sees an off-ramp. And as I said, he's already suggested that regime change has already happened and that the U.S. has already won. So, signaling in a sense that he wants to bring this war to a conclusion. I think the larger question, as you said, is what happens globally for the economy in the months ahead. Now we know that there's obviously shortages of energy supplies, but now we're also seeing significant damage to energy infrastructure in places like Qatar. And that foretells, much longer consequences for the global economy as well.
The economic destabilization many have predicted will lead to social destabilization as well, which really just means instability for everyone. It's a grim outlook, but many say that's the track we're on right now. Natasha, thanks. I think we have to lose you at this point, unfortunately. If you can stay with us, please do. But let me turn back to Tom, because as we talk about the other stakeholders involved, I wanted to ask you, Tom, specifically about Russian interests here. You heard the comments of our guest in Tehran. But this conflict has actually allowed Moscow to continue exporting oil and gas, even to Europe. And it's talking now to Washington about a settlement on Ukraine that some feel is playing into how Russia manages Tehran. How much leverage does Moscow have now? And is that good for U.S. interest?
Actually, Russia's situation has changed very little with regard to the war in Ukraine, which is much more important to Moscow than what's going on in Iran. And that situation has not changed. Ukraine's position is no different from what it was before. And in fact, if anything, Ukraine is feeling it could get a boost from closer ties with the very rich Gulf Arab states. If Ukraine can assist those countries in cost effectively shooting down Shahed drones, Ukraine stands to be one of the ironic winners of the war with Iran. The other point I would make, much of what Haim said is just not true. The American bases in the Middle East are still there. They're still functional. They're still doing what they were supposed to be doing. And the irony is that this war is actually pushing Gulf Arab countries closer to the United States and Israel because they are the countries with the technology that will keep Iran's threat at bay. One of the problems that the Gulf countries have realized, even though they did not want this war, is that Iran really is ready to hold a knife to their throats by blocking the Strait of Hormuz and showing they're prepared to do so, even on a war in which the Gulf Arab countries did not want, and thought they were going to be relatively neutral parties to. And so this is going to change the dynamic, much in the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine forced Finland and Sweden to join NATO. one of the ironies of this is that it is actually pushing the Gulf Arab countries to depend even more and seek closer alliances with the United States and, in some cases, eventually even Israel.
Okay, Haim, I'll let you respond to that. Last minute and a half.
Well, I don't think this is realistic to argue that. Basically, those Gulf countries looked to America for protection and didn't get it. And Israel got the lion's share of the missiles that they all need to stop the Iranian missiles coming in. In the last few attacks on Dimona and Arad, we saw that there were only 2 interceptors in those 2 attacks. Israel is running out of interceptors, and so are the GCC and Saudi Arabia. So if Thomas thinks that this is good for the Gulf countries, I don't think so. I don't think they need that shock to their whole system, not just to the economy, but to tourism and to actually the trust in the international trust that is suffered quite a shock. I do not believe that will make them better friends of United States and Israel.
Haim, that will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank my panelists so much for being with me, our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.